The Sterling estate sits on a sprawling, unforgiving stretch of the Connecticut coastline, surrounded by wrought iron gates that look less like a welcome and more like a warning. They call it Highcliffe. I've simply called it work for the better part of 42 years. When you spend 4 decades keeping another family's secrets, polishing their silver and arranging their white hydrangeas, you learn that houses have a pulse. You learn to read the silence in the hallways. You learn that the grander the staircase, the longer the shadows it casts. I am Martha, the head housekeeper of Highcliffe, and long before the events that shattered this family's legacy, I was the woman who saw everything and said nothing. It was the job, until it wasn't. If you had asked me what kind of woman could survive marrying into the Sterling family, I would have pictured someone forged in the same cold, old money furnace as Vivian Sterling, the matriarch of the house. I would have expected a woman with a pedigree, someone who knew how to wield a teacup like a weapon and a smile like a shield. Instead, Caleb brought home Harper. I remember the afternoon they arrived to announce their engagement. It was late October, the kind of crisp, brilliant New England day that makes the world look sharp and unforgiving. Caleb, the only son and sole heir to the Sterling real estate empire, looked lighter than I had seen him in years. For his entire life, Caleb had worn the weight of his mother's expectations like a tailored suit that was 2 sizes too small. He was a good man, kind, thoughtful, perhaps too eager to please a mother who could never truly be pleased. But he had always carried a quiet, persistent exhaustion. With Harper, that exhaustion was gone. Harper was 28 years old, with flyaway brown hair she didn't bother to constantly tame, a face free of the heavy, sculpted makeup favored by Vivian's circle, and a laugh that actually reached her eyes. She wasn't a socialite. She was an archivist and a restorer of antique documents for a historical society in Boston. She spent her days in climate-controlled basements, coaxing life back into crumbling paper, deciphering faded ink, and preserving the forgotten words of dead generations. She had the calloused fingertips of a woman who worked with her hands, and the deep, steady patience of someone who understood that some things take time to reveal their true nature. Standing in the grand foyer of Highcliffe, surrounded by centuries-old portraits and imported Italian marble, Harper looked entirely out of place. And yet, she stood completely unbothered by it. She didn't shrink away from the grandeur, nor did she try to puff herself up to match it. Vivian Sterling descended the main staircase that afternoon like a queen inspecting a newly conquered, albeit disappointing, territory. Vivian was a formidable woman. She was a descendant of minor northern Italian nobility, a fact she never let anyone forget. Her maiden name carried weight in certain dusty elite circles of Europe, and she wore her heritage like an invisible crown. At 65, she was impeccably maintained, her posture rigid, her voice a practiced, cultured purr that could freeze water. "So," Vivian said, reaching the bottom of the stairs and extending a single manicured hand toward Harper, "this is the girl who works with old paper." It wasn't a question, it was a categorization, an immediate, deliberate placement of Harper onto the lowest possible shelf in Vivian's mental hierarchy. Harper took the hand gently, offering a warm, genuine smile. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Mrs. Sterling. Caleb has told me so much about the estate. The architecture is breathtaking. It is limestone and marble, imported from Verona by my great-grandfather," Vivian replied smoothly, withdrawing her hand. "It requires a certain pedigree to appreciate fully, but I'm sure your little library is very nice too." I stood by the archway, holding a tray of sparkling water, and felt that familiar, heavy dread settle in my chest. I had seen Vivian dismantle people before. She never shouted. She never threw things. She used 1,000 tiny, paper-thin cuts of condescension, delivered with a polite smile, until the victim bled out socially and emotionally. Over the next few months, as the wedding preparations began, the psychological warfare became a daily routine. Harper moved into the estate's guest wing with Caleb for the summer, a trial period Vivian insisted upon to ensure the girl understood what managing an estate entailed. In reality, it was a siege. Vivian and her inner circle, her younger sister Aunt, and a revolving door of wealthy, arrogant cousins, operated like a pack of well-dressed wolves. They never outright insulted Harper in plain English. That would be uncouth. Instead, they weaponized their heritage. Vivian's family spoke a highly specific, archaic dialect of Italian among themselves. It wasn't the conversational Italian you hear on the streets of Rome or Milan. It was an older, formal dialect, rooted in the aristocratic courts of Florence and Venice. It was a language of exclusion, a velvet rope they strung up whenever they wanted to discuss something, or someone, they deemed beneath them. The first time I witnessed it, we were in the formal dining room. The table was set for 8, crystal gleaming under the chandelier. Harper was wearing a simple, elegant navy dress. Vivian's sister, Clara, leaned across the table and looked directly at Harper's dress. Clara smiled sweetly at Harper, then turned to Vivian and spoke in rapid, fluid Italian. Sembra una cameriera nei suoi giorni di riposo. Dove l'ha trovata per strada? She looks like a maid on her day off. Where did he find her? On the street. Vivienne chuckled softly, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. Un cane randagio che pensa di essere un levriero, she replied in the same language. A stray dog who thinks she's a greyhound. They both smiled warmly at Harper. We were just admiring your practicality, dear, Vivian translated, lying effortlessly. It's so refreshing to see someone who doesn't feel the need to dress for dinner. Caleb, sitting beside Harper, stiffened. He didn't speak the dialect fluently. Vivian had surprisingly never forced him to learn the archaic version, preferring to keep it as a secret language among the elders. But he knew the tone. He opened his mouth to defend her, but Harper placed a gentle hand on his knee underneath the table. Thank you, Vivian, Harper said, her voice perfectly level, her expression serene. I believe comfort should never compromise respect for the company. I was pouring wine at the sideboard and I paused. There was a fraction of a second, an imperceptible tightening of Harper's jaw, a brief flash of something sharp and cold in her brown eyes before it was buried away. Most people would have missed it, but I had spent 40 years reading the microscopic shifts in this house. She knew. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I didn't know how and I didn't know why, but as I watched Harper peacefully cut her fish while the women across the table continued to mock her in their secret tongue, I was certain of it. The girl who spent her life deciphering dead languages and restoring centuries-old European manuscripts understood every single syllable of their aristocratic poison. I watched her for weeks after that. I watched the way she navigated the sprawling, hostile mansion. One rainy Tuesday in November, a month before the wedding, Vivian hosted a luncheon for the estate's legal and financial advisors. This was when Marcus stepped fully into the picture. Marcus was the family's senior legal counsel, a man in his early 50s with silver hair, impeccably tailored suits, and eyes that always seemed to be calculating the exact net worth of everyone in the room. He carried himself with an authority that rivaled Vivian Sad's, and there was an intimacy in the way they spoke, a shared, ruthless understanding of power. After the luncheon, the guests had moved to the solarium. Harper had excused herself to the library to read. I was in the adjacent parlor, quietly dusting the bookshelves, invisible as always. Vivian and Marcus entered the hallway just outside the library doors, pausing by the large bay window. They didn't see me in the shadows, and they didn't realize the heavy oak door of the library was cracked open by an inch, where Harper sat reading in an armchair. They immediately slipped into their archaic Italian. "The boy is soft," Marcus murmured, his voice low and vibrating with disdain. "He's too busy playing house with the charity case to notice the margins." "Let him play," Vivian replied smoothly. "The wedding serves its purpose. It distracts him. By the time he realizes what the new trust documents actually entail, the ink will be dry. The liabilities will be entirely in his name, and the primary assets will remain under my control." "And the girl?" Marcus asked. Vivian laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Harper? She is nothing. A temporary fixture. A placeholder. Once Caleb signs, she'll be legally bound to a sinking ship with him. When the time comes to cut him loose, she'll take the fall right alongside him. She hasn't the intellect to understand a simple lease, let alone a generational corporate restructure." I stopped breathing. The dust cloth in my hand felt suddenly heavy. This wasn't just cruel mother-in-law behavior. This was a calculated financial assassination of her own son. I looked through the crack in the door toward the library. Harper was sitting in the wingback chair. Her book was resting on her lap. She wasn't reading. Her posture was rigid, perfectly still, like a deer catching the scent of a predator in the wind. Her eyes were fixed on the crack in the door, staring directly at the spot where Vivian and Marcus stood. The serene, accommodating facade she usually wore was completely gone. In its place was a look of such profound, quiet fury that it sent a shiver down my spine. It was the look of a woman who had just discovered a bomb under her home and was calmly calculating how to defuse it without blowing herself to pieces. Vivian and Marcus moved on, their footsteps fading down the marble corridor. I stood in the parlor for a long time, unsure of what to do. My loyalty had always been to the house, to the employment that kept a roof over my head. But Caleb was a good boy, and this girl did not deserve to be collateral damage in Vivian's endless war for control. Slowly, I walked into the library. Harper didn't jump. She just slowly turned her head to look at me. The vulnerability in her eyes lasted for only a second before the calm mask slipped back into place. "Martha," she said softly, "I didn't hear you come in." I walked over to the side table next to her chair and picked up her empty teacup. I looked down at the title of the heavy, leather-bound book on her lap. It was a 16th century treatise on Florentine property law, written entirely in the original dialect. I looked from the book up to her face. We held each other's gaze in the quiet, dusty air of the library. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of what I had overheard, and what I now knew she had overheard. I didn't offer her pity. Pity is useless to women like us. Instead, I leaned down slightly, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. "The silver letter opener on the desk in Mr. Marcus's private study," I said, my eyes never leaving hers. "It has a loose handle. Sometimes, when one is struggling to open a particularly stubborn drawer where important files are kept, a heavy letter opener is quite useful for applying leverage." Harper's eyes widened a fraction of an inch. She looked at me, truly looked at me, seeing past the gray uniform and the quiet demeanor of a housekeeper. She saw a woman who knew where all the keys were hidden. A slow, deliberate understanding passed between us. It was a silent pact forged in the shadows of a house built on arrogance. "Thank you, Martha," Harper said, her voice steady and clear. "I appreciate you taking care of things around here. Some messes. They require a very careful touch to clean up." "Indeed they do, ma'am," I replied, placing the teacup on my tray. "Indeed they do." The wedding went ahead a month later. It was a lavish, ostentatious affair that belonged in a magazine, entirely orchestrated by Vivian to showcase her own power. Harper walked down the aisle looking radiant, playing the part of the overwhelmed, grateful bride to absolute perfection. Vivian and her family smiled their camera-ready smiles, toasting the happy couple in English, and mocking them in Italian when they thought no one was listening. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured a pliable son and a foolish, harmless daughter-in-law. They didn't realize that Harper wasn't just surviving their fire. She was studying the blueprint of the furnace. And with me quietly leaving the doors unlocked in the dead of night, the archivist was about to start digging into the Sterling family's darkest vaults. The real war hadn't even begun. The winter that followed the wedding was brutal, even by Connecticut standards. Ice encased the wrought iron gates of Highcliffe, and the wind howling off the Atlantic sounded like a wounded animal throwing itself against the limestone walls. Inside the estate, the temperature was just as unforgiving. To the outside world, Caleb and Harper Sterling were the picture of modern aristocratic bliss. They attended the holiday galas, smiled for the society pages, and played their parts perfectly. But from my vantage point, polishing the silver in the dining room, sweeping the ashes from the massive hearths, I watched the invisible noose tightening around Caleb's neck. Vivian had stepped up her campaign. It was no longer just about alienating Harper. It was about isolating Caleb entirely. The Sterling real estate empire was vast, but it was aging, bleeding money in commercial sectors while sitting on a mountain of hidden liabilities. Vivian and Marcus, the silver-haired viper of a family lawyer, were moving pieces on a chessboard Caleb couldn't even see. They began flooding him with work. Caleb would return to the estate long after dark, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion, his shoulders bowed under the weight of endless meetings and crises that Marcus seemed to artificially manufacture. And through it all, Vivian played the deeply concerned, hovering matriarch. She would intercept him in the foyer, pressing a glass of scotch into his hand, murmuring in that soft, venomous tone about how much the family relied on him, how his father would be so proud, how Marcus was working tirelessly to streamline the family trusts to secure Caleb's future. It was textbook psychological manipulation. Break the boy down physically, overwhelm him mentally, and then offer him a seemingly simple solution wrapped in maternal devotion. Harper saw it all. She played the role Vivian had assigned her, the quiet, unassuming, slightly overwhelmed bride, with an Oscar-worthy dedication. She spent her days in the library or venturing into the city for her archival work, always returning with a warm smile and a soft demeanor. But at night, when the grand house finally slept, Harper became a ghost. It started a week after our silent agreement in the library. I was completing my final rounds at 2 a.m, checking the locks on the terrace doors, when I saw a sliver of light beneath the door of Marcus's private study on the ground floor. I paused, my hand resting on the heavy brass knob of the adjacent parlor door. I didn't knock. I simply stood guard in the dark hallway, a silent sentry in a gray uniform. Inside, Harper was working. She had found the silver letter opener with the loose handle, just as I'd mentioned. She had bypassed the archaic lock on the lower drawer of Marcus's mahogany desk, a lock designed to keep out nosy maids, not an archivist who routinely handled 16th century puzzle boxes. Over the next 3 weeks, I covered for her. I altered my cleaning schedule to ensure Marcus's study was empty when she needed it. I left the side door to the archives unlocked. I even started bringing her black coffee in the dead of night, leaving it silently on the edge of the desk while she photographed hundreds of pages of legal documents, trusts, and corporate restructurings with a small digital camera. One night, she looked up as I set the cup down. Her face was pale in the glow of the small desk lamp, her eyes burning with a fierce, quiet intensity. "It's worse than I thought, Martha," she whispered, her voice rough with fatigue. She gestured to a stack of thick, vellum-bound folios. "Marcus isn't just a lawyer. He's the architect of a slaughter." I remained standing, hands clasped in front of my apron. "What are they making the boy sign, ma'am?" Harper ran a hand through her hair, pointing to the margins of the documents. "Vivian has spent the last decade making catastrophic investments. Shell companies, toxic commercial real estate, massive unpaid tax liabilities offshore. She and Marcus have bundled all that poison into a new corporate entity. The papers they're pushing Caleb to sign, the restructuring, it transfers ownership of that entirely toxic entity directly to him. The moment he signs, he assumes personal liability for hundreds of millions in debt and potential criminal fraud." A cold dread pooled in my stomach. And Vivian? Her personal assets and the core profitable holdings of the Sterling Empire are being walled off in a blind trust she controls, Harper explained, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "When the Shell company inevitably collapses, the creditors and the federal government will go after the sole owner on paper. Caleb, he'll lose everything. He could go to federal prison. And Vivian will walk away clean, mourning her tragic, incompetent son." "How can you be sure?" I asked, looking at the dense legal jargon. Harper touched the edge of the paper gently, the way she might touch a fragile artifact. "Because Marcus is arrogant. He drafts the official documents in English, but his personal notes, the real strategy, the instructions between him and Vivian, they're written in the margins of his private drafts." She looked up at me, her eyes dark. "In their archaic Italian dialect, they think they're the only ones in the world smart enough to read it." She had spent weeks cross-referencing the financial data with the Italian margin notes, using her expertise in historical linguistics to translate Marcus's shorthand. She hadn't just uncovered a bad deal, she had uncovered a meticulously planned execution. "What do we do?" I asked, realizing I had crossed the line from housekeeper to accomplice, and not caring one bit. "We let them set the table," Harper said, gathering her things. "And then we burn the dining room to the ground." The trap was sprung on a Thursday in late January. Vivian announced she was hosting an intimate dinner party to celebrate the successful conclusion of Caleb's transition into his new role as head of the family trusts. The guest list was small but suffocatingly powerful. Vivian, Marcus, Vivian's sister Clara, 2 senior partners from Marcus's law firm, and of course, Caleb and Harper. The atmosphere in the house that day was thick and heavy, like the air right before a thunderstorm. Vivian was in high spirits, directing the kitchen staff with the crisp, efficient energy of a general preparing for a victory parade. She ordered a menu that felt intentionally oppressive. Heavy truffled risotto, braised veal ossobuco, rich Barolo wine. It was food meant to sedate, to make a person pliant and agreeable. When evening fell, the dining room was a portrait of gilded menace. The chandelier cast sharp, glittering light over the crystal and the antique silver. Caleb arrived late, looking like a man who had been hollowed out. His skin was gray, his eyes bloodshot from staring at spreadsheets he was too exhausted to fully comprehend. Vivian immediately swarmed him, kissing his cheek, praising his dedication, guiding him to the head of the table with a maternal grip that looked suspiciously like a restraint. Harper sat quietly near the middle of the table, wearing a simple dark green dress. She had styled her hair up, exposing the long, elegant line of her neck. She looked completely serene. If I hadn't seen her photographing documents at 3 in the morning, I would have thought she was just another decorative, clueless wife. I stood by the sideboard, a white napkin draped over my forearm, managing the footmen who served the courses. I watched the dynamics play out like a choreographed dance. Marcus dominated the conversation, keeping it light, jovial, yet subtly asserting his dominance over Caleb. He poured Caleb's wine himself, a gesture of faux camaraderie. Vivian and Clara periodically exchanged glances, slipping into their Italian dialect to make swift, brutal assessments of the room. During the risotto course, Clara looked at Caleb, who was massaging his temples, barely touching his food. Clara smiled and said in her fluid, aristocratic Italian, "Guardalo, è così stanco che firmerebbe la sua stessa condanna a morte se gli dicessi che lo farà dormire." Look at him. He is so tired he would sign his own death warrant if you told him it would let him sleep. Vivian took a delicate sip of her wine. "Ed è esattamente quello che farà stasera," she replied in the same tongue. "And that is exactly what he will do tonight." They chuckled. Marcus, who understood them perfectly, offered a thin, knowing smile before turning back to one of his partners to discuss golf. Harper took a bite of her risotto. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She just chewed, her face a perfect mask of polite disinterest. The dinner dragged on. The plates were cleared, the heavy meats consumed, the wine bottles emptied and replaced. Caleb looked physically ill by the time the dessert plates were removed. "Well," Vivian said, her voice cutting through the post-dinner lull. She placed her napkin on the table and folded her hands. "As wonderful as the food is, we do have a small bit of family business to conclude. Caleb darling, Marcus has brought the final trust restructuring documents." Marcus smoothly retrieved a thick black leather portfolio from the briefcase at his feet and placed it on the polished mahogany table directly in front of Caleb. He unclasped it, revealing a formidable stack of paper flagged with dozens of yellow sticky notes indicating where a signature was required. Beside the portfolio, Marcus placed a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. "It's all standard, Caleb," Marcus said, his voice a soothing baritone. "We've discussed the broad strokes. This consolidates the commercial holdings, streamlines the tax burden, and places the executive authority entirely in your hands, just as your mother wished. I know you're exhausted, so I've marked the signature lines to save us from reading through 300 pages of boilerplate legalese." Caleb stared at the thick stack of paper. He rubbed his eyes. "Marcus, I haven't had time to have my own guy review the final draft. The commercial debt load on that new subsidiary—" "Caleb, please," Vivian interrupted, her tone suddenly sharp, carrying a mother's manufactured disappointment. "Do you think I would let Marcus put anything in front of you that wasn't to your absolute benefit? We have been working on this for months to protect you, to protect our family's legacy. Stalling now just invites the IRS to look closer at the old holding companies. Don't be ungrateful." It was the perfect strike. It targeted his exhaustion, his loyalty, and his deep-seated fear of failing the family name. Caleb exhaled a long, defeated breath. He reached out and picked up the gold pen. He pulled the first document toward him, moving the pen toward the bottom right corner of the page. Clara leaned toward Vivian. "Finalmente," Clara whispered in Italian. "Il capio è stretto." "Finally, the noose is tight." Vivian smirked. "Povero sciocco," she murmured. "Poor fool." Caleb's pen touched the paper. Before a single drop of ink could bleed into the page, a hand shot across the table and clamped down over Caleb's wrist. The movement was so fast, so entirely unexpected, that the entire room froze. It was Harper. She wasn't smiling anymore. The serene, accommodating facade had vanished completely, shattered like cheap glass. In its place was a woman forged in absolute, terrifying resolve. She held Caleb's wrist in a vice grip, physically stopping the pen from moving. "Harper?" Caleb asked, startled, looking at his wife as if he had never seen her before. "Do not sign that," Harper said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the heavy air of the dining room like a scalpel. Marcus bristled, instantly shifting into a defensive, patronizing posture. "Harper, dear, this is complex legal and financial business. It's not something you need to concern yourself with. Why don't you let Caleb—" Harper ignored Marcus entirely. She didn't even look at him. She turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking directly onto Vivian's face at the head of the table. When Harper spoke next, the words did not come out in English. They came out in perfect, flawless, aristocratic Italian. The exact same archaic regional dialect Vivian and her family had used to mock her for the past 8 months. Her pronunciation was immaculate, carrying the haughty, rolling cadence of the northern nobility. "Povero sciocco, hai detto, Vivienne?" Harper's voice rang out, cold and clear as a winter bell. "Poor fool, you said, Vivian." The blood instantly drained from Vivian's face. She sat back in her heavy dining chair as if she had been physically struck. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Clara gasped aloud, dropping her linen napkin onto the floor. Marcus froze, his hand halfway to the portfolio, his eyes widening in sudden absolute panic. Harper didn't stop. She kept her grip on Caleb's wrist, but her eyes bored into her mother-in-law, her Italian flowing with devastating fluency. "Pensavi che fossi sorda o semplicemente stupida?" she continued, the words sharp and venomous. "Did you think I was deaf or simply stupid? Hai passato mesi a insultarmi in faccia, pensando che la tua lingua morta fosse uno scudo. Ma non è uno scudo, Vivienne, è una confessione. You spent months insulting me to my face, thinking your dead language was a shield. But it's not a shield, Vivienne. It's a confession." Caleb looked wildly between his wife and his mother. "Harper, what? What are you saying? You speak Italian?" Harper finally released his wrist. She stood up slowly from her chair, her posture impeccably straight. She reached over, picked up the thick leather portfolio of contracts, and slammed it down onto the center of the table with a resounding crack that made the crystal wine glasses rattle. "I'm saying, Caleb," Harper said, switching back to English, her voice ringing with authority, "that your mother and her lawyer just tried to hand you a loaded gun and tell you it was a gift." She opened the portfolio, flipping rapidly through the pages until she found a specific section. She pointed a sharp finger at the dense text. "This is not a trust restructure to protect you," Harper said, addressing Caleb but ensuring every word was loud enough for the paralyzed room to hear. "This document transfers 100% of the toxic assets from the old Sterling Holding Company, the shell corporations, the offshore tax liabilities, the commercial defaults that Marcus has been hiding for a decade, directly into a new subsidiary. A subsidiary of which you, Caleb, are the sole legal owner and guarantor." Caleb stared at the paper, his exhaustion suddenly vanishing, replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. "Liabilities? Marcus said this was just transferring the core equity." "Marcus lied," Harper snapped. She looked up at the lawyer, her eyes ablaze. "Didn't you, Marcus? You drafted the core equity to remain in a blind trust controlled entirely by Vivian. Caleb gets the debt. Caleb gets the tax fraud charges when the feds finally audit the accounts. Caleb goes to prison and you two keep the clean money." "This is outrageous," Marcus finally sputtered, standing up, his face flushed dark red. "This is slander. You have no idea what you're reading, you little archivist. You're misinterpreting standard indemnification clauses." "Am I?" Harper challenged, not backing down an inch. She reached into her clutch purse resting on the table and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She tossed it onto the contracts. It was a blown-up photograph of one of the pages I had watched her capture in the study. "Because according to your own handwritten notes in the margins of Draft 4, written in Italian by the way, you specifically told Vivian." Harper switched seamlessly back to the archaic dialect, mimicking Marcus's exact phrasing perfectly. "L'idiota prenderà l'esca. Assicurati solo che firmi prima della fine del trimestre fiscale." The idiot will take the bait. Just make sure he signs before the end of the fiscal quarter. Marcus stared at the photograph of his own handwriting. The color washed completely out of his face, leaving him looking gray and suddenly very old. He collapsed back into his chair, the fight draining out of him instantly. Silence descended on the dining room. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of an empire collapsing inward. Vivian stared at Harper, her chest heaving, her perfectly maintained composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. For the first time in her life, she was looking at someone she couldn't control, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't hide from. The stray dog she had mocked was a wolf, and it had its teeth buried securely in her throat. Caleb stood up. He didn't look at his mother. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at the gold pen resting on the table, then at the contracts, and finally at Harper. The betrayal on his face was absolute. It was the look of a man watching the entire foundation of his life crumble to dust. He slowly reached out, picked up the stack of contracts, and in one swift, violent motion, tore the thick stack of paper completely in half. He threw the ripped pages onto the center of the table, directly into the remains of the risotto. "Caleb," Vivian choked out, her voice trembling, reaching a hand out toward him. "Caleb, please, you don't understand." Caleb didn't let her finish. "Don't ever speak to me again," he said, his voice a dead, hollow rasp. "Don't call, don't write. If you or Marcus come near me or my wife again, I will take these margin notes straight to the federal prosecutor myself." He turned to Harper and held out his hand. Harper didn't gloat. She didn't smile triumphantly. She looked at Vivian one last time, a look of profound, crushing pity, before placing her hand in her husband's. Without another word, they turned and walked out of the dining room, their footsteps echoing sharply against the imported Verona marble. I stood by the sideboard, the white napkin still draped over my arm. I watched the two senior partners from the law firm hurriedly get up and essentially flee the room, desperate to distance themselves from the blast radius. I watched Clara sit trembling in her chair. I watched Marcus staring blankly at the ruined contracts. And I watched Vivian Sterling, the invincible matriarch, sit alone at the head of her gilded table, surrounded by the wreckage of her own arrogance, finally understanding what it meant to be truly, utterly powerless. I stepped forward quietly, picked up the empty wine bottles, and began to clear the table. Some messes, as Harper had said, require a very careful touch. But this one I was going to enjoy watching them clean up themselves. If you think a shattered aristocratic ego concedes defeat quietly, you have never worked for old money. The morning after the dinner party, Highcliffe Estate felt less like a home and more like a war room. The silence in the grand hallways was absolute, but it was the heavy, vibrating silence of a drawn bowstring. I went about my duties as usual, ensuring the fires were lit and the silver was polished, but I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. When the masters of the house are bleeding, it is best for the servants to remain entirely invisible. Vivian Sterling did not weep. She did not retreat to her chambers to mourn the loss of her son's affection. Instead, she summoned Marcus before the sun had even cleared the horizon. They spent 4 hours locked in her private sitting room, pacing like caged leopards. When Marcus finally emerged, his face was pale, his jaw set in a line of grim, desperate determination. He looked like a man who had just realized the lifeboat he was sitting in had a hole in the bottom, and he was deciding who to throw overboard first. By noon, the retaliation began. It was swift, brutal, and entirely financial. Vivian used her executive power as the matriarch of the primary family trusts to freeze every single one of Caleb's corporate accounts. She deactivated his security clearances at the Sterling downtown offices. But the true venom lay in the legal courier that arrived at the small, 2-bedroom apartment Caleb and Harper had hastily rented in the city. I learned the details later, of course, when the final pieces of the chessboard were revealed. But the threat was agonizingly simple. When Caleb had turned 21, fresh out of college and desperate to please a mother mourning the sudden death of his father, he had blindly signed a stack of introductory board documents. Vivian and Marcus had dug those ancient signatures out of the archives. They had drafted a letter stating that unless Caleb returned to Highcliffe, apologized, and signed the new restructuring agreement, they would present those old documents to the federal authorities, framing Caleb as the sole mastermind behind the decade of tax evasion and offshore shell companies. It was blackmail, raw, unadulterated extortion wrapped in a linen envelope with the family crest stamped in wax. Vivian expected them to crumble. She expected Caleb to come crawling back within 48 hours, broken by the threat of federal prison, begging for his mother's protection. She expected Harper to be terrified, a civilian caught in the crossfire of a billionaire's blood sport. She expected a surrender. What she got, exactly 3 days later, was an execution. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The winter sun was casting long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rugs in the main library. Vivian was sitting in a high-backed leather chair by the fireplace, sipping Earl Grey tea. Marcus stood by the window, nervously checking his gold pocket watch. I was meticulously dusting the upper shelves, a phantom in a gray uniform. When the heavy oak doors of the library opened, Vivian didn't even turn her head. She merely smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of her lips. "I knew you would come to your senses, Caleb," she said, her voice dripping with maternal condescension. "Marcus has the papers ready. We can forget this whole ugly misunderstanding." But it wasn't a broken boy who walked into the room. Caleb walked in with his shoulders squared, his posture immaculate, radiating a cold, terrifying calm I had never seen in him before. And walking beside him, carrying a battered, heavy canvas messenger bag, was Harper. "We aren't here to sign anything, Mother," Caleb said. His voice was steady, devoid of the desperate need for approval that had choked him for 28 years. Marcus turned from the window, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Harper's canvas bag. "Caleb, this isn't a game. The letter we sent you wasn't a bluff. The authorities are going to be very busy," Harper interrupted, her voice cutting through the room with the precision of a diamond blade. She walked over to the massive mahogany desk in the center of the room and unbuckled the canvas bag. Vivian finally turned her head, her smile faltering as she looked at her daughter-in-law. "I don't know what you think you're doing, you arrogant little girl," Vivian spat, dropping the pretense of politeness. "But you are playing in a league you do not understand. You speak a little Italian. Congratulations. That doesn't change the law. It doesn't change the signatures Caleb put on those documents 7 years ago." Harper didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She reached into the bag and pulled out a thick, plastic-wrapped bundle of heavily aged, water-damaged ledgers. "Do you know what the hardest part of archival restoration is, Vivian?" Harper asked, resting her hand on the ancient books. "It isn't translating the dead languages. It isn't repairing the torn vellum. The hardest part is provenance, proving exactly where a document came from and who touched it last." She pulled out a second stack of papers. These weren't old ledgers. They were crisp, modern photocopies. 2 years ago, Harper continued, her eyes locking onto Marcus, the Sterling Corporation made a very generous, tax-deductible donation of historical family business records to the Boston Historical Archives. A write-off. You thought you were clearing out the basement of the downtown office. Just boxes of useless paper from the 80s and 90s. Marcus swallowed hard. The color began to drain from his face once again. "My department handled the intake," Harper said, her tone conversational, yet utterly lethal. "And while I was restoring the ledgers from 1998, I found something fascinating. I found the original incorporation documents for the offshore shell companies, the ones you just threatened to blame on Caleb." Vivian gripped the armrests of her chair. Those are corporate records. They prove nothing about who initiated them." "Oh, but they do," Harper smiled, a cold, empty thing. "Because Marcus is a creature of habit. He didn't just write his little Italian notes in the margins of Caleb's current contracts. He's been doing it for decades." Harper picked up one of the photocopies and read from it, translating perfectly. "The Cayman accounts are secure. The husband suspects nothing. Once he is out of the picture, the boy's inheritance will funnel directly to us." The silence in the library was so profound I could hear the fire crackling in the hearth. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet by 20 degrees. "The husband," Caleb repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You wrote that 2 months before my father died of a sudden heart attack." Vivian stood up, her teacup rattling violently against its saucer. "Caleb, listen to me. This is fabricated. She made this up." "I didn't need to make anything up," Harper said softly. She reached into the bag one last time. "Because I didn't just find financial ledgers, Marcus. I found the personal correspondence you accidentally boxed up with them, the letters you wrote to Vivian, the hotel receipts from Geneva, the transfer of funds from the corporate accounts to a private villa in Tuscany under your sister's name." She tossed a bundle of letters onto the desk. 15 years, Harper said, looking between the two of them with absolute disgust. "You two have been sleeping together and stealing from this family for 15 years. You weren't trying to protect Caleb's legacy. You were trying to frame him for your own embezzlement so you could finally run off with the clean money." Marcus staggered backward until he hit the windowsill. He looked like a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. The arrogant, untouchable lawyer was gone. In his place was a terrified, cornered thief. "It's over, Mother," Caleb said. The heartbreak in his voice was raw, but it was heavily armored in resolve. "I have my own legal team now." Harper handed the restored archives over to them yesterday morning. They spent the night reviewing the timeline. "The federal fraud case against you and Marcus is insurmountable. The embezzlement, the tax evasion, the conspiracy." Vivian was hyperventilating, her hand clutching her pearls. The aristocratic mask had completely melted away, leaving a desperate, vicious woman behind. You think you've won? Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. You think you can take me down? I control the core assets. The blind trust holds the voting shares of the real estate empire. Even if I go to prison, I will tie this family's money up in litigation for the rest of your miserable lives. You will inherit nothing but ashes, Caleb, you hear me? Ashes. She was right, of course. The structure of the Sterling Empire was a labyrinth. Even with the fraud exposed, Vivian still held the keys to the kingdom's treasury. It was the ultimate scorched earth defense. But then Caleb smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a tired, grim expression of a man who had finally outgrown his childhood nightmare. No, Mother, Caleb said quietly. You don't. He reached into his own coat pocket and pulled out a single, neatly folded document. He walked over and placed it on the desk, right next to the evidence of his mother's betrayal. I am not the naive, exhausted boy you thought you were manipulating, Caleb said, his voice steady. I knew there was poison in the water. I just didn't know how deep the well went. When you started pushing me to sign the restructuring documents 6 months ago, I knew something was wrong. I knew I couldn't trust Marcus, and I knew I couldn't trust you. Vivian stared at the document on the desk, her eyes wide with a sudden, uncomprehending terror. What did you do? She whispered. I used the one loophole you and Marcus forgot to close when I turned 25, Caleb explained. The contingency clause. I had full legal authority to transfer my unencumbered, clean voting shares, the true core of the company, into an independent, irrevocable trust of my choosing, provided I was of sound mind and not under financial duress at the time of transfer. Marcus let out a choked gasp. You couldn't have. Without my signature, the family office would never have processed. I didn't use the family office, Caleb snapped. I used a private firm in New York, and I did it 3 weeks before the wedding, before you started starving me of sleep, before you threatened me. I moved the entire clean foundation of the Sterling Empire completely out of your reach. Vivian leaned heavily against the edge of the desk, her legs trembling. She looked at the document. Who is the beneficiary? Who controls the irrevocable trust? Caleb turned and looked at Harper. The absolute, unshakable trust between them was something I had rarely seen in my 4 decades in this house. It was a bond forged in fire, impenetrable and absolute. Harper does, Caleb said. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vivian slowly turned her head to look at the young woman standing across the desk. The girl she had called a stray dog. The girl she had mocked in a dead language. The girl who wore cheap dresses and worked with old paper in dusty basements. Harper Sterling was now the sole legal controller of the clean, multi-billion-dollar core of the Sterling family empire. Harper didn't gloat. She looked at Vivian with the cold, detached professionalism of a surgeon examining a tumor that was about to be excised. The paperwork was finalized months ago, Vivian, Harper said softly. While you were busy insulting my clothes in Italian, I was busy securing your son's future in English. You have nothing. No leverage. No core assets. All you have is the toxic debt you built, the fraud you committed, and the federal investigators who are going to knock on these doors by the end of the week. Vivian let out a sound that I can only describe as the dying breath of a dynasty. Her knees buckled. She sank into the heavy leather chair, burying her face in her hands, her immaculate composure reduced to violent, silent sobs. Marcus didn't cry. He looked at the door, then at Caleb, his eyes darting frantically as his survival instincts kicked in. Caleb, listen, Marcus stammered, holding his hands up. I was following her orders. She manipulated me. If I cooperate with your lawyers, if I turn state's evidence against her, the sheer cowardice of the man was breathtaking. At the first sign of a sinking ship, he was ready to drown the woman he had claimed to love for 15 years, just to save his own tailored suit. Harper looked at Marcus, her expression hardening into something resembling stone. You can tell that to the prosecutor, Marcus. We are done listening to you. Caleb took Harper's hand. He looked around the grand library, at the portraits of his ancestors, at the marble fireplace, and finally, at the sobbing ruin of his mother. We are leaving now, Caleb said. My lawyers will handle the eviction notices for Highcliffe. I suggest you both use whatever time you have left to find very good defense attorneys. They turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. As they passed me, standing quietly in the shadows by the bookshelves, Harper paused. She turned her head slightly, her brown eyes meeting mine. I didn't smile. I merely offered a very slow, very respectful nod. A silent acknowledgement between the woman who guarded the secrets and the woman who finally weaponized them. "Thank you, Martha," Harper whispered, so quietly that only I could hear. "It was an honor, Mrs. Sterling," I murmured back. And as the heavy doors clicked shut behind them, leaving the traitors to suffocate in the ruins of their own making, I finally put down my dust cloth. I had a feeling I wouldn't be needing it much longer. The days immediately following that afternoon in the library were not marked by screaming matches or thrown porcelain. They were marked by a suffocating, terrifying quiet. It was the sound of a massive ancient ship taking on water, the hull groaning under the pressure just before it slips beneath the surface forever. I stayed, of course, not out of loyalty to Vivian, but because a good housekeeper never leaves a mess half swept. I wanted to watch the dust settle. Marcus, true to his cowardly nature, vanished from Highcliffe within the hour. He didn't even pack his imported cigars from the humidor in his private study. He drove his Mercedes back to the city, no doubt spending the entire commute desperately dialing the personal numbers of federal prosecutors, begging for a plea deal before Vivian could throw him under the bus first. There is no loyalty among thieves, especially when the thieves are wearing bespoke suits and facing a decade in a federal penitentiary. Vivian, however, remained in the house. For the first 3 days, she operated under the delusion of her own invincibility. She paced the marble hallways, her phone glued to her ear, barking orders at junior partners in Marcus's firm, demanding they find a loophole, a contingency, a way to freeze the irrevocable trust Caleb and Harper had established. But the junior partners stopped returning her calls. The bank managers at her offshore accounts suddenly became unreachable. The socialites who used to drink her champagne and laugh at her cruel jokes in Italian suddenly found themselves too busy to attend her luncheons. The velvet rope of high society, which Vivian had used to keep the world out, had suddenly been pulled tight around her own neck. Then came the morning the black SUVs arrived. It was a cold, overcast Tuesday, almost exactly a week after Caleb and Harper had walked out. I was polishing the brass handles on the front doors when the caravan of vehicles crunched up the long gravel driveway. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just the quiet, relentless efficiency of the federal government coming to collect its due. I opened the door before they even had to knock. 4 agents in dark windbreakers with the letters IRS and FBI stamped across the back stepped into the grand foyer. They did not wipe their feet. They did not look intimidated by the imported limestone or the centuries-old portraits. To them, Highcliffe wasn't a castle. It was a crime scene. Vivian descended the main staircase. For the first time in 42 years, she looked her age. Her hair, usually sprayed into a perfect silver helmet, was flat. She wore no makeup. The silk dressing gown she wore seemed suddenly too large for her shrinking frame. "Miss Vivian Sterling?" the lead agent asked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy." She didn't fight. She didn't scream in her aristocratic Italian. She simply descended the final few steps, holding onto the mahogany banister as if her legs could no longer support her. As they read her rights and placed the heavy steel handcuffs around her manicured wrists, she looked at me. Our eyes met across the foyer. In her gaze, there was shock, humiliation, and a sudden, desperate plea for an ally. She wanted me to comfort her. She wanted the invisible woman in the gray uniform to tell her that it was all a terrible mistake, that she was still the queen of the manor. I looked at her, my face entirely impassive. I reached into the pocket of my apron, pulled out a clean white dusting cloth, and turned my back on her to resume polishing the brass door handle. I heard the heavy oak doors close. I heard the engines of the SUVs fade down the driveway. And then, for the first time in decades, Highcliffe was truly, wonderfully silent. The ensuing legal bloodbath was a spectacle that fed the New York and Boston society pages for months. Marcus, as expected, flipped instantly. He handed over every password, every offshore routing number, and every encrypted email in exchange for a reduced sentence in a minimum security facility. He sat on the witness stand and detailed exactly how Vivian had orchestrated the bleeding of her own family's empire, leaving Caleb holding the bag. Vivian tried to fight, but the evidence Harper had provided was absolute. The restored ledgers, the personal letters, the Italian margin notes. It was an airtight coffin of her own design. She was stripped of her remaining assets to pay the massive federal fines. The blind trust she thought would protect her was seized. Highcliffe was liquidated by the banks to cover the commercial defaults. The matriarch who had prided herself on her flawless pedigree was sentenced to 8 years in a federal women's correctional facility, where I imagine her archaic Italian dialect is of very little use in the cafeteria line. People who followed the scandal, the journalists, the high society gossips, even Caleb himself, often marveled at the incredible stroke of luck that brought the Sterling Empire down. They called it divine intervention. They called it poetic justice. What were the odds, they asked, that the exact boxes containing the evidence of Vivian's 15-year fraud would be randomly donated to the exact historical society where her new, brilliant daughter-in-law worked as a senior archivist? What a remarkable, miraculous coincidence. I sit now on the porch of a small, quiet cottage in Vermont, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. I bought this place in cash a few months ago, using a retirement fund I had been quietly, meticulously building for 40 years. I watch the snow fall through the pine trees, and I think about coincidences. There is something you must understand about women like me. Women who wear uniforms. Women who pour the tea, sweep the ashes, and stand in the corners of grand rooms while powerful people make decisions. We are invisible. You look right through us, assuming that because our hands are busy scrubbing your floors, our minds must be equally occupied with nothing but the dirt. But when you are invisible, you see everything. And when people think you do not understand them, they say exactly what they mean right in front of you. Vivian Sterling thought her archaic, aristocratic Italian was a secret code. She thought it elevated her above the common people. But if you stand in a dining room for 40 years, pouring wine while the same family speaks the same dialect day after day, year after year, you learn. You don't need a university degree. You just need a sharp mind and absolute silence. I understood their Italian perfectly by my 5th year at Highcliffe. I knew about the embezzlement. I knew about the affair between Vivian and Marcus. I knew about the offshore accounts. And most importantly, I knew exactly where Marcus kept his old physical records. He was a paranoid man. He didn't trust the cloud or digital servers for his most damning crimes. He kept the original handwritten ledgers and Vivian's love letters in heavy locked banker boxes in the deepest, dampest corner of the estate's sub-basement. A place only the housekeeping staff ever went. For a long time, I did nothing. I was a practical woman. I needed my salary. And frankly, the Sterling family's rot was their own business. I watched Vivian treat her staff like indentured servants, stealing wages, firing maids for making eye contact, and treating us all as less than human. I swallowed my pride, day after day, and kept the house clean. But then Caleb's father died, and I watched Vivian turn her venom onto her own son. I watched her slowly, methodically begin to mentally destroy a kind, gentle boy just so she could maintain absolute control of his inheritance. That was the line. I decided quietly and without fanfare that Vivian Sterling needed to be dismantled. But a housekeeper cannot bring down a billionaire. If I had gone to the police with the boxes, Vivian's lawyers would have crushed me. They would have claimed I forged them, or stole them, or was simply a disgruntled employee looking for a payout. I would have spent my twilight years in a courtroom, or worse, in a jail cell. I needed a weapon. I needed someone on the inside who had the intellect to understand the evidence, the legal standing to use it, and the absolute unbreakable motivation to protect Caleb. I waited for 10 years, and then Caleb brought Harper home. The day I met her, I knew. I saw the intelligence in her eyes. I saw the calluses on her hands. When I looked into her background, a simple Google search from the estate's kitchen computer, and saw she was an expert in archival restoration and historical linguistics, the pieces of the chessboard suddenly clicked into perfect alignment. 3 months before the wedding, Vivian ordered me to clear out the sub-basement. "Get rid of the junk, Martha," she had snapped, waving a manicured hand. "Donate whatever old books are down there for the tax write-off. I don't care where it goes, just get it out of my house." I didn't call the Salvation Army. I didn't call the local library. I personally packed the 4 heavy banker boxes containing Marcus's decades-old fraud ledgers and Vivian's love letters. I arranged the courier, and I specifically, deliberately addressed the shipment to the intake department of the Boston Historical Archives, care of the senior preservationist, Miss Harper Evans. I knew it would take time for her to process the donation. I knew the water damage on the ledgers would require her specific expertise. I knew that once she started peeling back the layers of those old papers, her brilliant mind would recognize exactly what she was looking at. I didn't warn her. I didn't tell her what was coming. I simply planted the seed in her garden, stepped back into the shadows, and let her grow into the absolute force of nature I knew she could be. When the time came, when Vivian and Marcus finally backed Caleb into a corner at that dining room table, I didn't have to lift a finger. I just stood by the sideboard with my white napkin, watching the weapon I had armed execute its target with flawless, devastating precision. Last week, I received a letter at my cottage. It was written on thick, beautiful stationery, postmarked from New York. It was from Harper. Caleb and Harper didn't move into a mansion. They bought a beautiful, historic brownstone in Brooklyn. Caleb started a new, ethical real estate development firm, entirely divorced from his mother's toxic legacy. Harper is back to restoring documents, only now she funds the Historical Society entirely through the clean trust she controls. The letter was short. It didn't mention the trial. It didn't mention Vivian. It simply asked how the winters were in Vermont and enclosed a photograph of Caleb, looking healthy, rested, and genuinely happy, standing in a sunlit kitchen with a golden retriever. At the very bottom of the page, beneath her signature, there was a brief postscript. It was written in flawless, flowing Italian. I fondi dei vecchi scatoloni erano insolitamente puliti, Martha, quasi come se qualcuno li avesse spolverati prima di spedirli. The bottoms of the old boxes were unusually clean, Martha, almost as if someone had dusted them before shipping them. I smiled, tracing the ink with my thumb. She knew. She had always known. The archivist who missed nothing had eventually realized that the evidence didn't walk into her office by itself. She knew exactly who had given her the matches to burn the Sterling Empire to the ground. I folded the letter and placed it on my mantelpiece next to a small silver letter opener with a slightly loose handle. If you are a woman of a certain age, reading this or listening to this, and you have spent your life feeling unseen, if you have been talked over at dinner tables, dismissed in boardrooms, or treated as part of the furniture in your own family, I want you to remember Martha the housekeeper. They will mistake your silence for ignorance. They will mistake your patience for weakness. Let them. Let them build their arrogant little kingdoms and speak their secret languages, thinking you are too small to understand the world they rule. Do not waste your breath trying to convince them of your worth. Conserve your energy. Keep your eyes open. Learn the layout of their house. Find where they bury their secrets. And when the perfect moment arrives, whether it takes 4 weeks or 40 years, you will not need to raise your voice to bring their walls crashing down. You just have to know exactly which thread to pull. The snow is falling harder now, blanketing the Vermont woods in a pure, unbroken white. It is quiet here. It is peaceful. And best of all, the only messes I have to clean up now are entirely my own.